Hello everyone and welcome to Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Well, it's hard to believe, but it's been 25 years since Suzuki released the DR-Z400 in the year 2000. Since then, it's become a bit of a legend with riders all over the world using the DR-Z for everything from commuting to work to round the world adventure type travel, dual sport rides on the weekends, and everything in between. So what is a dual sport motorcycle? So in my opinion, a dual sport motorcycle should be equally adept at going on-road and off-road. So as opposed to heavier adventure bikes, which often really struggle with their off-road ability due to their weight and their size, the dual sport should be very, very good off-road. But it should also be decent enough on the highway to do commuting to work, some light duty adventure travel, and things like that. But it also, importantly, it should not be based on a competition motorcycle. So it should have longer maintenance intervals that would allow you to accumulate higher mileage without having any issues or frequent maintenance. If you think about it, if you look at the marketplace today, there's actually very few true dual sport motorcycles that are still for sale. Now, I just was fortunate enough to spend 2 days riding Suzuki's brand new 2025 DR-Z4S on and off-road in the beautiful mountains in Oregon. And today I'm going to give you my in-depth review of this motorcycle. Now, I'm going to warn you, this video is going to be technical, it's going to be in-depth, and we are going to talk about absolutely every little tiny detail of this bike. So if you're just looking for a quick ride impression video, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of those coming out about the same time that this video comes out. But I think it's important to go in depth on this bike because it's so rare. It's been 25 years since we've seen a new DR-Z, and I think it's just really important to cover all the details here if you're looking to buy a new dual sport bike. Some disclaimers as we get started. I am not paid to do reviews like this, as opposed to some internet comments I see out there that I just don't even know where they're coming from. People who review motorcycles like me, we don't get paid to review motorcycles. This is part of our journalistic responsibility to go ride, test, and report back on these bikes. That's what we do. So there's no financial relationship there with the manufacturer, in this case Suzuki. I also want to take a second to thank Suzuki and acknowledge them for not only inviting me to the press launch, because I may have been one of the only YouTubers or the only YouTuber there among all the legacy media, so I really appreciate that, but also to Suzuki for providing some technical support for this review, so I really appreciate that. All right, so why am I qualified to review the DR-Z? Well, for one, reviewing motorcycles is literally what I do as my 9-to-5 job. This is my job, this is how I make a living, and I've been doing it for a number of years. I've ridden at least around 150 different motorcycles, and I've personally owned at least about 50 different motorcycles. I've also owned all of the popular dual sport motorcycles out there, at least from the United States perspective of the bikes we get here. So everything from this bike's predecessor, the DR-Z400S, I actually owned 2 different ones of those over long periods of time and put a lot of miles on the previous DR-Z, but I've also owned all the competition to the DR-Z. I've owned the DR-350 before I had the DR-Z. I've had the KLX300 recently. I've owned a KTM 690. I've had a WR250R from Yamaha. I've had a KLR650. I've had a DR650. I've had just about everything, so I can really offer you a perspective of somebody who's owned and worked on and modified almost all these dual sport motorcycles. All right, so how's this video going to be structured? Let me just briefly talk about that. So first of all, a note about the SM or the Supermoto model. There are many differences between the S model and the Supermoto model. I think that it is maybe natural to think that it's just a change in the wheel set, but that is not the case. There are many differences between the SM and the S, and unfortunately this review is not going to be able to get into the Supermoto model, and we're just going to focus on the S model for this video. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to review the basic specs of this new DR-Z4S and how they compare to the outgoing DR-Z400. Then I'm going to go in depth about everything that is new, all the new mechanical differences and features and engineering that has gone into this new bike. Then I'm going to show you the riding position, the seat height, the ergonomics, and do the drop and lift test. Then I'm going to do detailed riding impressions both on and off road. After that, I'm going to talk about how does this new DR-Z4S differ in the key performance areas between the outgoing DR-Z400. Then I'm going to talk about the pricing. I know the pricing is a big area of discussion with this bike. I'm going to go in depth on that. And actually, I'm going to tell you through some data and hopefully some reasonable, rational arguments why I actually disagree with the internet. And I actually think this bike's price is fairly reasonable. Then we're going to review the differences compared to its main competitors in the dual sport category and even the adventure bike category. We're going to get into that because a lot of people are comparing this to some of the lightweight adventure bikes, which is not really an apples to apples comparison, but because people are cross shopping, I am going to go ahead and do that. So the Honda 450RL, KTM 350 and 500, the KLX300, CRF450RL, bikes like KTM's new 390 Enduro R, we're going to get into all of that. Then I'm going to summarize the pros and cons. And finally, I'll end with some final thoughts, including explaining why I think it is probably likely that I will end up purchasing one of these DR-Z4Ss as my own personal dual sport bike sometime in the next year or two. All right, let's get into the specifications of the DR-Z4S, how it compares to the outgoing model, the DR-Z400S. So backing up a second here to talk about why is there a new bike. So the reason that there's a whole new model here from Suzuki is that the outgoing carbureted DR-Z400S, which has been around for about 25 years, it did not meet the newer Euro 5 Plus requirements for emissions, noise, and for safety with things like ABS. So by last year, 2024, the DR-Z400 was actually only for sale in North America and not anywhere else around the world. So Suzuki has given us a new bike to be able to sell a model, a dual sport model, worldwide in many different countries because they couldn't do that with the outgoing bike. So a lot of the updates that you see, including the fuel injection, the ABS braking system, and the updates to the engines to address noise and emissions, a lot of these were made for compliance reasons. But as I'm going to get into throughout this in-depth review, a lot of these changes benefit us as riders of this bike and give us better performance on and off-road and just make it a better motorcycle overall. So I'm sort of giving away my conclusions here, but anyway, let's start to get into this. So pricing, we'll have a section on the pricing where I go into this and talk about, is this reasonable or not, because a lot of people are upset about it. It's $89.99. The outgoing bike was $71.99, so more on that in a minute. The engine is still a 398cc single-cylinder liquid-cooled motor, about 38 horsepower and 27 foot-pounds of torque. I'll put the Newton meters here below. That's the same as the outgoing bike, so no real change to the power output, but as I'll discuss in a minute, the power delivery is a little bit different and you now have a boost in power at high RPM and also in low RPM and in terms of torque. So the peak output is about the same, but the way it delivers it is much better now. The compression ratio actually went down a tiny bit, so they didn't give us a big jump in compression ratio like some updates you see out there with other bikes where then you start requiring premium fuel and higher maintenance. They didn't go that route, and I think that's good because it keeps it regular fuel and it keeps it a lower maintenance motorcycle. Of course, a big change here is with the fuel system. So now we have electronic fuel injection with a nice big 42mm throttle body. The outgoing bike had a Mikuni BSR 36 carb, 36mm. So we have much superior operation in every imaginable way with the fuel injection. And throughout this, I'm sure, hour-long video, we're going to talk all the reasons why and prove that point. The oil system. So it still retains the dry sump oil system. The DR-Z has been known for that. What that means is that the oil tank is inside the frame of the bike. So unlike a wet sump engine where the oil capacity or oil tank is below the engine, makes the engine taller, reduces the ground clearance, with the DR-Z they've had the dry sump system, so the oil is stored in the frame of the bike and it increases your ground clearance, makes the engine a bit more compact, and I'm glad that they kept with that. Now, a sore point for many people is the transmission. It is still a 5-speed transmission. I've had to do a lot of digging and research into this transmission thing. So here's what I found. First of all, let me cover this first. So the gear ratios. I did some deep digging on the internet, ended up looking at the service manual of the new DR-Z4S. The gear ratios have not changed. A lot of people were hoping that Suzuki would give us a wider ratio transmission or jump us up to a 6-speed with wide ratios would have been much better. They chose not to do that. And I know many people are disappointed. We'll talk about how this plays out in terms of the riding. What they did do is they changed the final drive ratio. The final drive ratio is the relationship between the front and the rear sprocket. So the bike still has a 15-tooth front sprocket, but what they did is on the rear sprocket, they went from a 44 down to a 43, which makes the gearing a little bit taller, taking our final drive from 2.933 down to 2.866. So I did notice when testing the bike, it felt a little bit more relaxed when you're cruising on the highway at higher speeds, and I think that's the reason why. However, you can change the final drive ratio on your motorcycle on your own, so we didn't really need Suzuki to do that for us, and we would have rather seen them change the internal gear ratios, which unfortunately they did not. We asked Suzuki at the press launch, why did they not give us a 6-speed? And we didn't honestly really get a clear answer to that, so I can only assume, and I hate to assume, and this is just an assumption, but I can infer that it must be something to do with cost, budget, and just the engineering involved with that. They must have not thought was worth the cost for the benefit that they would have gotten there. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just telling you why I think that decision may have been made. Let's talk about the weight of the bike. The weight of the bike did go up slightly. Some people out there have been upset about this. I think you're making too much of it. I've owned 2 DRZs before. Riding this new DRZ, it's about 13 pounds or 5 or 6 kilograms heavier. I could not notice that. What I did notice was better performance of the motorcycle in almost all aspects. I did not notice the weight difference. However, it is true that on paper, it got a little bit heavier. Why did it get heavier? Well, the ABS system, the lines for that, the ABS pump, all the stuff that goes with that, that adds quite a bit of weight. The fuel injection system adds weight. However, as I'm going to talk about in the rest of the video, I think that that was worth it because having the ABS brakes, having the fuel injection, the other upgrades, I believe are really, really excellent and more than justify the slight increase in weight. That's my opinion after actually riding the bike for 2 days. The seat height of the bike actually went down about a ½ inch or about 15 millimeters. That's nice and that's noticeable, and we'll talk more about that. The ground clearance is the same at 11.8 inches or 300 millimeters. Suspension travel is about the same. However, they did go down a tiny bit in the front from 11.3 inches to 11 inches. So tiny bit there. The rear is the same. The suspension now has full adjustability with rebound added in there on the rear, whereas the previous model did not have that, so that was nice to see. Fuel capacity went down slightly from 2.3 gallons or 8.7 liters to, it went from 2.6 gallons or 9.9 liters down to 2.3 gallons or 8.7 liters. But it's more than made up for the fact that the new bike, because it's fuel injected and has many other engine updates, is much more fuel efficient than the outgoing model. So we kind of made up for it there, but still, I would have liked to seen a larger fuel tank, and I'll talk about that later. Maintenance intervals, thankfully, are still the same. So your minor services, your oil changes, is at 3,500 miles or 6,000 kilometers. Your major service intervals, your valve clearance inspection, is still way up there, 14,000 miles or 24,000 kilometers. Compare that to something like a Honda 450RL or KTM 500EXC, which literally you're checking the valves every couple of thousand of miles compared to 14,000 miles. That is a huge difference if you're actually going to put miles on the bike. All right, let's talk about the updates to the bike. What are the things they redesigned, the new engineering? There's some pretty fascinating stuff in here. Let's take a deep dive. So on the engine, Suzuki's goals with the engine redesign. They wanted to make it Euro 5 Plus compliant while also increasing drivability, smoothing out the power delivery, increasing fuel efficiency, and increasing the overall refinement of the motor. They kept the dry sump lubrication system, which increases the ground clearance. We've talked about that. That was really great. Of course, they changed from carburetor to fuel injection, and we're talking about that a lot. Internal changes to the engine. So let's go through this. The new engine now has lightweight titanium intake valves and hollow sodium-filled exhaust valves. It has new camshaft profiles, so they optimize the lift and the valve overlap, so better performance and increasing that compliance with Euro 5 Plus. They redesigned the cylinder head, they optimized the shapes for the intake port, the intake valve periphery, and the smooth flat combustion chamber produces better combustion with the new engine. So together, the new piston and the crankcase designs reduce mechanical losses by an impressive 20%. So that means you've got smoother engine operation, increased power output right all the way up to the rev limiter, and I can confirm it is a nice big difference, and much improved fuel economy. They have a new 42mm bore electronically controlled throttle body. It improves output and delivers really good and smooth throttle response. They've added dual spark plugs now, so that makes smoother power delivery, lower fuel consumption, lower emissions, better throttle response, easier engine starting, and a more stable idle. And I can confirm this bike runs so much more smooth and more refined than the outgoing bike did. They also changed the inlet tube for the air cleaner box. It just improves airflow and improves low-end torque. Moving on to the clutch, we now have SCAS, or Suzuki's Clutch Assist System. What that means is that you effectively have like a slipper clutch, okay? So the assist function of the clutch, what it does is it makes taking off from a stop easier. So in Suzuki speak, it says it's a precision engineered cam to engage the clutch sleeve hub and pressure disc together and efficiently transfer torque to the rear wheel while using softer clutch springs. So what it means is that you have a softer clutch pull, easier takeoff. And then for the slipper clutch, it partially disengages when downshifting to decelerate and mitigate the effect of harsh engine braking, reducing rear tire hopping, and providing better deceleration. Just better downshifting, less wheel lock up when you kind of downshift too aggressively there. On the exhaust system, they've redesigned it now to meet Euro 5+. It has 2 catalytic converters in it and an O2 sensor. I can tell you it's quiet, which I'm a big believer in quiet motorcycles because they help keep our trails open and help preserve motorcycling to ensure that it keeps going on into future generations. So please be a part of that instead of being a noise polluter. So that's a big thing, big movement that I'd like to start there. Now, let's get into the electronic rider aid. So this is a big one. Before I talk about the rider aid specifically on the DR-Z, allow me to give you an argument in favor of electronic rider aids on motorcycles. You guys know I test motorcycles for a living now, right? Hundreds of different bikes that I've tested. I ride bikes with the aid systems and without. And categorically, I will tell you that the modern motorcycles, I'm not talking about bikes 10 or 20 years ago with the traction control and ABS, but the ones that are coming out now, these systems make the bike so much better and so much nicer to ride. So here's my arguments for this. One common refute that I hear is that you just need to learn to ride the motorcycle. All right, I hear this a lot, especially from the older guys out there. This is really just false. So one, that argument assumes that everyone out there is an expert rider with a lifetime of riding experience, grew up riding dirt bikes in the hills, and they can control the power perfectly and everything like that. That's not true. That is not the case. Number two, that argument assumes that you are better at preventing a crash than the advanced sensors in the bike controlling the ABS and the traction control, which is wrong because look at how many accidents there are out there caused by completely preventable loss of control due to wheel sliding under acceleration or braking. Basically, you guys are losing control of your bikes for preventable things that rider aids would have helped with because you're making abrupt inputs to the motorcycle. This is the most common cause of motorcycle accidents. So there's that. And often this happens in a panic or abrupt situation, a split-second decision where even if you are a very good rider, you may just give it too much brakes at the wrong time. With ABS, that would have prevented that crash. I've seen this personally, and I see this all the time. So ABS brakes in particular greatly reduce motorcycle accidents. Now, I've talked about this. The modern systems are far superior to what they were 10 or 20 years ago. If you tried a bike 10 or 20 years ago with these systems and it sucked, that's because they did kind of suck. But they don't suck anymore because technology has advanced greatly. Now remember, even though the DR-Z is a dual sport motorcycle that will be used off-road part of the time, it's also going to be used on the highway. So when people are going to work, commuting down the highway, they're going to benefit from these safety systems. It's not a dirt bike, it's a dual sport bike. Another argument, the best riders in the world, many of whom I've ridden with and trained with, they use the rider aids. They do not turn them off. Okay? And finally, the systems can be turned off when needed. Now, this was a bit of a rant, and I'm just going to have my rant here because I really feel strongly about it. All right, so let's talk about this Suzuki Intelligent Ride System, or SIRS. So first of all, the DR-Z does still have mechanical throttle cables. However, they go into a sensor box that then gives an electronic signal to the throttle body. So it's a bit of a hybrid system. When they say it's ride-by-wire, you actually still see the 2 throttle cables, but it does go into a sensor box and then it becomes electronic. The bike has something called Easy Start System. All the Easy Start System means is that all you have to do is give the start button a momentary press and let go. You don't have to hold it down, and a motorcycle will crank the sufficient number of times and it will start up perfectly. Works great. All Suzukis have that nowadays. You have drive mode selector A, B, and C. You have traction control with 3 levels, including fully off. And you have ABS that can be turned off to one or both of the wheels. Now, let's get into details of what that means. So the drive modes, how do those work? So what the drive modes do, a lot of people have the misconception that they give you less power. Some motorcycles out there, that's true. Usually it's not. Usually what this is, and what it is with the DR-Z, is it controls the relationship between the throttle angle, throttle position, how far you crack the throttle, and how far it actually opens the throttle bodies. So all modes have the same ultimate power output if you go at wide open throttle. So A mode, what A mode does, it's like a boost mode. It artificially boosts the low throttle openings and gives you more acceleration even with a small throttle opening, so it's an aggressive throttle. B mode is normal or 1-to-1, which I prefer, and C mode is like a rain mode, so it's an under throttle. It gives you a little bit less throttle than you are asking for at the hand grip, so it's good in slippery conditions for newer riders or if you're riding in the rain or whatever the case may be. There's a huge difference between the modes when we tested them during this 2-day ride. They're super easy and fast to switch between them, and they work great, and we'll elaborate more on that in the riding sections. So let's talk about the traction control system. Now, modern dual sport and adventure motorcycles have traction control systems that are specifically designed for off-road use. It's not like the old days when it was just for street. The mistake a lot of riders make is turning the system completely off and never even experimenting with it or learning how to use it to your advantage. So the TC system has 4 different modes. Levels 1 and 2 are for street use. They're more intrusive, right? They're for use on pavement, high grip situations. You have G mode for off-road, and then you have totally off. What I like about the traction control on this bike is it remembers the setting. When you turn the bike on and off, even with the key, it remembers the traction control mode that you were in. Now let's talk about the G mode. The G mode is actually brilliant. It is an off-road traction control setting. You can go up loose, rocky hill climbs, even with a tire that may not be that great for those conditions, and the bike will stay in line and get you up that hill, even if you apply way too much throttle. It's kind of like a cheat code, and it works really, really well. And even the professional off-road riders during this ride, we really appreciate the G mode. We still turned it off at certain situations, but it was a very, very useful tool to have depending on what you were doing. And it feels very natural. All right, let's talk about the ABS system. So by default on the DR-Z4S, the ABS system is going to be turned on at both wheels. Now, it also resets to that condition whenever the bike is keyed off and on. Now, some people will say, oh, that's a legal requirement, but that is not the case, and that's a myth because there are many motorcycles, and I could name some, like Ducatis and BMWs and KTMs, where when you turn the rear wheel ABS off and you cycle the bike with the key, it remembers that setting. So I don't think that's a legal requirement. But Suzuki has been conservative and chosen to do that. Now, if you leave ABS on to the front and back tire, it's actually still usable on dirt roads and flat ground situations. It actually stops pretty well. But if you get into real off-road situations, hills and rocks and loose things, you do need to turn off the rear ABS because it will become too intrusive. So to turn off the rear ABS, you hold down the ABS button for about 2 seconds and it'll turn off the rear ABS. If you hold it down again, it will then turn off both wheels, and then to turn the system back on, you just give the button 1 click and it turns back on. All right, let's get into updates to the chassis. So it's got the same 21 18-inch wheel set as before. Of course, if you get the Supermoto model, that's different, but we're talking about the S model for this review. In terms of the brakes, the front and rear discs did get larger, and the improvement in stopping power is very noticeable versus the old bike, which I have a lot of experience with. The tires are Japanese-made IRC dual sport tires, and although they didn't look that good, they performed surprisingly well on our 2 days of riding. Now, the frame is actually all new. It's still made of steel, which I think is good, but it's a twin spar design as opposed to the single spar design on the old DRZ. This makes the bike more rigid, handles better. It's a more modern frame design. However, the downside of that potentially is that it may complicate aftermarket companies in developing larger fuel tanks because it's harder to design around that twin spar frame than the old frame design was. So the suspension, similar design and setup to before, but you have new settings, new valving. I don't know if they changed the spring rates. I really couldn't tell, and there's no data on that. But the bike handles better. Now there's a tiny bit of less travel in the front. They did add rebound adjustment to the rear shock. Overall, the suspension performance is definitely better than the outgoing bike, which I already thought was actually pretty good. So the ergonomics, they adjusted the ergonomics of the DR-Z quite a bit, and I think they made some really good improvements. So you have a wider seat that's noticeably more comfortable than the old bike. It sits 15 millimeters or ½ inch lower, which is good for everybody. The larger foot pegs that are set a little bit further back, and then now you have a 1 1/8 inch handlebar as opposed to the old 7/8 handlebar, and it's 28 millimeters or just over an inch higher, which feels better when you're standing. Overall, the ergonomics feel better, and they were pretty comfortable for all-day riding, including long sections of single track where we're standing up. Electrical features. So you've got a new LCD dash. It still doesn't have a tachometer, but it adds things like a gear indicator, the ABS and traction control mode display, a new fuel gauge, which is very nice to have, and readouts for things like instant and average fuel consumption, which is very, very handy to see your fuel consumption. You also get, in terms of electrical stuff, new LED lighting in the front and the back, plus new hazard lights, which are very, very handy to have. All right, let's talk about ergonomics and riding position and drop and lift tests. So I'll put up some video here, me sitting on the bike and doing things like that. The seat height is lower than before. We've talked about the specs of that, and you definitely do notice it. I found the overall riding position to be very good. Now, a lower seat is available. I do want to pause or take a second. You know, dual sport motorcycles are really tall because they have to have long travel suspension for off-road performance. And it's a bit sad because what it means is that the average human being in the world who is only 5 foot 4 inches tall or 162 centimeters, that's the average height for a person on the earth, and earth is where we live, by the way, if you didn't notice that. So what it means is that most motorcycles in general are too tall for the people of average heights. And it's a shame. And I think we don't talk about that enough. But it is part of the design because of the way the suspension is, and the engine takes up room in the frame. So how are you going to get a low seat height on a dirt bike? It's really, really difficult to do. Now, okay, then getting into the drop and lift test. It feels heavier than like a KTM 500 because it is, you know, about 80 pounds or 30 kilograms heavier than that, but it also feels much lighter when doing this versus any adventure bike. So that is a very noticeable difference.
All right, first ride on the new DR-Z. It feels kind of like the old DR-Z so far, but just a lot more refined, smoother, quieter, more equipment. And yeah, I'm looking forward to riding it for the next couple days. My face shield is fogging up because it's freezing cold and wet here because we're in the rainforest of Oregon. So I'm trying out this G mode, gravel mode on the traction control. And I need to test it more, but man, it sure feels good right now. Yeah, I think this traction control is going to be underrated by a lot of these test riders who are dirt guys who don't appreciate what traction control can do when it's tuned right. Suspension feels great. Handling feels good, suspension feels good, everything feels good so far, but we're just starting out. We're gonna have a good mix of on and off road this next 2 days. You! Man, I wish we had more trails like this in California. Ooh. So I've got front ABS turned on, which I like, rear ABS turned off, and I'm still using the G mode. I really like this G mode a lot. Like, it doesn't, you don't feel like it's cutting your power, you know, you just feel like the bike is just going where you want. Through all this rocky stuff, the suspension is great. So I didn't think these stock tires would be any good, but I gotta say, they're not that bad. These stock tires are not bad. I mean, we are not riding slow. Don't hit Zach, don't hit Zach. There's Zach Quartz in front of me. Everybody knows Zach. Handling is really good for, you know, you see the weight of this bike, but then you're like, oh, I don't know, but actually handling seems quite good. I mean, this is a very early impression, but so far, even at 65 or 70, it feels very smooth. It doesn't feel like the old DRZ at all on the highway. So we're going to have to investigate this more, but everyone's wondering, you know, is the lack of 6 gears going to be an issue? So far, I would say no, but we need more testing to figure that out. Yeah, suspension, baby. This thing is pretty good. Yeah, the rear shock is a little soft, but that could be an easy change, which is maybe just changing the spring, you know, on the rear shock. Yeah, as we start to get into the steeper terrain, the tires do start to show their limitations a little bit. This DRZ, like, we've been riding off-road most of the day. I'd actually prefer to do a little bit more street riding. It's a little more, I think we will later. But man, the stability, the predictable handling, like, it has enough agility for the trail, but it's pretty stable and predictable, which is a good thing for a dual sport bike. The suspension is soft but compliant and well tuned, well controlled. The ABS off-road works really well for the front wheel. The traction control works really well. Like, I don't know, this bike seems pretty darn dialed. Like, everybody, all of the people I'm riding with are like more, oh, there you go, Zach, more like legacy media. But everybody's really impressed with this so far. This gets my attention. This is pretty legit. You have to use your front brake. You wouldn't be able to control your speed just using the rear. Yeah, this is fun. I was loose. Woo! Okay, note to self for this review. It's been about 4 hours, 4 to 5 hours of riding, and my butt is starting to feel the seat for sure. It's a big improvement from the seat that we saw on the old DRZ, and I think it's a lot better than the seat like on the Honda 450 or a lot of other dual sport bikes. But yeah, I'm starting to have some pain in the old rear end at this point, about, you know, 2/3 of the way through our first day of riding. My notes on the fueling, I've been keeping track of it all day. Like, the fueling, no matter the mode you're in or whatever, and any gear at any speed, super smooth, just very well fueled on the fuel injection. No jerkiness, nothing that, you would have to complain about there. It's just been fantastic. Also, the brakes are very strong. I was very happy with that. And then on the highway, like, the roll-on acceleration power was really good. Oh wow. Huh, there we are. The Oregon coast. That's fantastic. It's not foggy. Wow, gorgeous. I bet that water's not too warm though, I'll tell you that. Wow, that's really something. Beautiful. There is something about the ocean that just really soothes the soul, you know. Yeah, so in terms of power on the new DR-Z, the mid-range feels as good as it always did, but where you notice is the low-end power feels better, and the top-end power on the over-rev, you know, when you really rev it out, that also feels quite a bit better to me than the old DR-Z. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with the power level. Like, it's enough power to do what you want to do on the highway and off-road for sure. Like, there is a dramatic difference between this and a KLX300 or a CRF450RL, like a dramatic difference. Honestly, the bike still really would benefit from having a 6th gear. It's better than before, and they've done a good job, I think, managing the vibrations, but it would be so much better if it had a 6th gear, because above about 65 miles an hour, or above about 100 to 105 kilometers an hour, you start to feel that lack of that overdrive gear for sure. Okay, so today on the DR-Zs we're doing more of this trail single tracky stuff, which is fun because I don't have a lot of this where I live, so this is kind of fun to do. It's also good practice for me because I don't get enough of this kind of riding back home. We've all been kind of commenting, you know, how good of a trail bike this actually makes. It's kind of surprising how good it is. Man, I can't see very well. It's so dark in here with the sunglasses on and the dust. The DR-Z, you get fully adjustable suspension, so you can really tune things in how you want. It's got a lot of travel. It's pretty much like a dirt bike suspension, you know. And yeah, I mean, it feels like just kind of a heavy dirt bike out here. But then you can commute to work during the week, so that's really nice. The other thing I really have come to appreciate about this bike is the fueling is really, really good. Like, you don't, you know, it's not like the Honda 450 where you have to, you know, sort out all the fueling and ECU and spend all the money on the pipe and all that. You don't have to do that here, I think, which is a huge money saver on this bike. And I really like having the ride modes too. That's been great. Don't crash. You know, so the DR-Z, while it is a lot heavier, you know, than a dirt bike would be, actually, because it's kind of soft and kind of stable, you can do this kind of all day, as long as it doesn't get too technical, and then you get too tired and the bike's too heavy. But if you're just doing stuff like this, you can do this all day. It's comfortable, and then, you know, it's kind of cool because you've got a bike you can still, you know, do some light adventure riding with or commute to work with during the week. I mean, that's pretty fantastic. I mean, this bike is like totally legit off-road, like super legit. I mean, it's not holding us back really at all with the suspension or the handling or anything. I mean, the only thing maybe limiting us a little bit is the tires from going faster, but and you could change that. But this thing is in such another league than like a KLX300 or a CRF300, and I much prefer this to the lighter and supposedly higher performance Honda 450, because although this is heavier, I don't know, this runs so smoothly and never stalls and doesn't anything weird with the fueling, and it's just a little bit softer and more gentle. And yeah, I just for actual dual sport riding, I think this is much better than the Honda, and it's cheaper than the Honda, so you have to consider that. Okay, so I want to test the ABS. I turned the ABS back on because it is tuned a little bit for dirt, but not for like hardcore dirt. So let's try to get up to like 40 miles an hour or something, if I can here, and then test the ABS. Okay, full ABS. Actually, you know what? That stops pretty good, even with ABS on. You wouldn't want to use it for dirt biking or single track, but for dirt roads, you could leave the ABS on. It actually works well.
All right, so how does this bike perform compared to the outgoing model? So in terms of feeling a weight, I know it did gain a little bit of weight. As I mentioned earlier, I couldn't notice that. And I think the other differences kind of overcome that. So it felt about the same weight to me. The fueling, the throttle response, the fuel mapping, all of that, it is so much better than the outgoing bike. So like when I had my own DRZs and I owned them, I of course had all these different carburetor modifications, whatever. And even then, it didn't run as good as this new fuel-injected bike, not even close. If you compare this fuel-injected bike to a stock outgoing DRZ carbureted model, oh my gosh, it's like night and day better, so much better. Consistent starting, better performance at different temperatures, cold mornings, high altitudes, whatever it is, fuel injection just runs flawlessly, as it should. The engine feel, so it's smoother, it feels more powerful. Although there's not more peak power, I just think because they've smoothed out the power delivery, especially at those high RPMs and low RPMs, it feels better that way. It's quieter, more refined, all of that. Suspension and chassis feel, it feels much better to me. The bike feels more modern and sharper. It's still plush and comfortable like the old DRZ was off-road, which is a good trait about the DRZ, but it feels more connected to the trail. I think your tires stay in contact with the ground better, tracks the ground better. Suspension feels improved, not dramatically, but a little bit better. Highway riding, so you know, they did, as we talked about, they gave us that slightly taller final drive ratio, although disappointingly they didn't change the internal gear ratios or give us a 6-speed. So how does it feel at 65 miles an hour or about 100 kilometers an hour compared to the old bike? So the old bike felt pretty buzzy and pretty busy, you know, like it was revving kind of high once you get up around 65 or 70 or around 100, 110 kilometers an hour. The new bike feels better, a little bit better, not dramatically better, just a little bit. And I think that the slightly taller gearing, or final drive gearing, which you could have done with sprockets on the old bike, and just the more refinement overall, less buzziness of the whole bike, makes it feel a little better, but not dramatically so. And the bike still really needs a 6th gear, you know, to really be comfortable cruising above 70 miles an hour or above 112 kilometers an hour. The braking system, definitely better, I think, than the outgoing bike for sure. I'm a hard braker. I will go right up to the threshold of braking, and I felt that it was better. And then, of course, the rider aid. So we've talked about that, the ABS and traction control, all the stuff. They really do, and the riding modes as well. I believe that they add to the riding experience and are genuinely useful both on and off-road, and I think that makes it a better bike. All right, let's jump into the pricing on the DR-Z4S. So it's been controversial when this was announced. A lot of people, including me, I admit, saw the $9,000 price, and we kind of had a moment where we're like, that seems really high. So let's try to just be reasonable and look at data and look at facts, and then I'll kind of tell you how I personally feel about it. So the new bike is $9,000, and I'll put the chart up here, right? The outgoing bike was $71,999. Keep in mind, though, that the DR-Z400 was at the end of a 25 or 24 year production run. So what happens is when they release a new bike, it tends to be like whatever price point it is, and then they're able to they don't necessarily increase the price over the production run of that bike to keep up with inflation. They don't necessarily do that. And that was the case with the DR-Z400 because, you know, the data shows that when I adjust the 2001 DR-Z400S, which was $5,449 for inflation, that is $8,900. So in fact, the 2025 DR-Z cost the same as the 2001 DR-Z did. Interesting. Who would have known? Now, comparing it to some other bikes, the 450RL from Honda, higher performance, more competition focused, doesn't have good fueling, doesn't have good low speed manners, but has a lot of other good qualities, including a 6th gear and a little bit more power, is $10,099, so about $1,000 more. KTM 500 EXC, competition ready bike, terrible on the highway though, not really a true dual sport, whereas the DR-Z is a true dual sport. $13,000 for that bike. Okay, now if you go down, KLX300 is $5,500, CRF450RL is $5,700. Okay, but you know, dramatically less power, dramatically not as good suspension in terms of the travel or the performance of the suspension. So you're getting rid of a lot of power and a lot of suspension capability there if you go down to the 300s. And I've had both those bikes already. So, but those are good value, I admit. And then a lot of people are looking at the new 390 Enduro R, which, you know, hopefully KTM makes it through the current drama, and if this bike does actually come out, which I think it is, but I hope, $5,500 for that. That's a screaming deal. I don't know how KTM is doing that, but that does represent a really good value. So is the DR-Z price right? I think it's pretty close to the Honda 450 in terms of like overall performance, although, you know, a little less power, maybe suspension not quite as stiff for fast riding. You don't have the 6 speeds, but it's more of a, the DR-Z is more of a true dual sport. I think it is closer to that 450 than it is to like the KLX300. So I think that price point is, it's not crazy. Maybe a little bit high, maybe $500 high on the pricing, and then not having the 6 gear kind of makes it sting a little bit more. I do also think that in a few years, $9,000 is going to seem cheap because we've been seeing this inflation, and that's what happens over time. It seems expensive now. I think in a few years it won't seem too bad. But that's just my opinion. I don't want to tell you what to think. I really don't want to tell you what to think. That's not fair. But I try to give you the data. But how I feel is, I don't think it's terrible. All right, let's talk about the main competitors to the new DR-Z4S. Let's talk about its place in the motorcycle market, right? What category does it fall into? So I see a lot of this out there where people are trying to compare it across to an adventure bike, but the DR-Z is a dual sport bike and a pretty high performance one at that. So, you know, where this fits in, the DR-Z4S is a dual sport that has quite a bit more power and quite a bit more suspension capability than like a KLX300 or a CRF450RL. But also, it's less competition oriented and less maintenance intensive than a Honda 450RL or a KTM 500. So it slots right in between those two kind of categories. And I think that's a really good thing because I think for most riders, I think that's kind of actually what you're looking for, including myself. Now, it's not really an adventure bike. Those are more like travel-oriented motorcycles like the Himalayan 450, the KTM 390 Adventure, or the CFMOTO Ibex 450. Those bikes are heavier. They sacrifice off-road performance for on-road and touring capability. So those are adventure bikes. Now, the DR-Z can be used for as a lightweight adventure traveler, depending on your standards of comfort and everything. And of course, a lot of people already do that with the outgoing DR-Z, and even I did actually. The fact is the DR-Z really doesn't have any true direct competition. There's stuff kind of above it and there's stuff kind of below it, but it fills an important gap. So I've got a chart here that I've probably had on the screen now for a minute now that I'm looking at it. And you can, you know, geek out on weight comparisons and specs and things like that. Do keep in mind that like on that KTM 390 Enduro that everybody's talking about, that's, you know, a good 30 pounds or a good 15 kilograms or so heavier than the DR-Z. So it also doesn't have the suspension performance of the DR-Z. It's a shorter travel, and I don't think is really much of a dirt bike setup as the DR-Z is. All right, so what are the pros and cons summary to the DR-Z4S? And I apologize if any of this gets repetitive, but some people only watch this pros and cons sections. I know from watching my YouTube data, so here we go. Pros and cons. So the pros for me, great performing, long travel suspension, excellent suspension performance. Super smooth engine response, super smooth fueling. It doesn't need money spent on expensive ECU upgrades or exhausts that are going to make it loud and obnoxious or anything like that, as some of the competitors do to run right. The rider aids, they're super useful both on and off road. The maintenance intervals, they're long and they make the bike appropriate for longer distance traveling or for crewing more miles. Highway power is adequate and good, unlike the CRF300 and the KLX300 and those bikes that really struggle on the highway. This bike doesn't have that problem. Fuel economy was excellent during our test. Suzuki claims even better than that. They claim something like 70 miles a gallon or 3.3 liters per 100 kilometers. However, I think we were seeing more like 60 miles a gallon, which is still good. That's still 3.9 liters per 100 kilometers, still pretty good there. And of course, another pro is Suzuki, their legendary reliability. What are the downsides? What are the cons? The lack of the sixth gear definitely still is a big downside. I admit that. The somewhat small fuel tank. I don't know why dual sport bikes have always 2-gallon fuel tanks or 8-liter fuel tanks. Give us a little bit more than that. I think would be nice. The seat is still not very comfortable. After 2 or 3 hours, the seat still hurts. It's better than the old bike, but it's still not great. The ABS reset feature, we talked about that. Some of you are going to say, well, that's a legal requirement. No, it isn't. Maybe the front ABS reset is, but not the rear wheel ABS, because there's lots of bikes that don't reset the rear wheel ABS when you cycle the key. This bike does, and that gets annoying. So what we end up doing on this bike is just leave the key on all day. If it's just short stops, 10 or 20 minutes, we don't turn the key off, because then you'd have to reset your ABS. And also the final downside, I think its price relative to the competition is a little bit steep, although not as terrible as the spec sheet warriors on the internet would have you believe. Final thoughts on Suzuki's DR-Z4S. I think it comes down to who is the DR-Z4S for? What kind of customer is the right fit for this bike? And I think the answer to that, in my opinion, is really clear. So let's assume you're somebody who doesn't want a high maintenance, high strung, not very highway friendly KTM or Husky, or even maybe the Honda 450RL. But you want a good, solid dual sport bike with a good performance on and off road, with legitimately good suspension, a decent amount of power around that 40 horsepower mark. And you also want something that you can stack some miles on, maybe commuting to work, doing some light adventure travel. You're not worried about the high maintenance and the reliability factors. At the same time, maybe you've tested bikes like Kawasaki's KLX300, Honda CRF450RL, or bikes in that category, but they just don't have enough horsepower or enough suspension performance or capability for what you're looking for. Well, that leads you right to the DR-Z4S. And despite the admitted downfall of still not having a sixth gear, maybe being a little bit heavy, maybe being a little bit overpriced, especially at its introduction here in 2025. Despite those things, I still think that the DR-Z4S is a fantastic choice in the dual sport category and is going to make a lot of riders really, really happy. If you're in the market for a dual sport motorcycle or you need to upgrade your dual sport motorcycle, you need to give the new DR-Z a very, very strong look. All right, well, if you like the kind of work I do here at Big Rock Moto, I hope you will support this channel. There's a number of ways to do that, including subscribing, using my affiliate links, and joining up on Patreon. I really appreciate that. Thanks again to Suzuki for supporting me throughout this review. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for watching. Ride safe, and I'll see you out there.